This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Volume 1, Chapter 1, in which the reader is introduced to a man of humanity. Late in the afternoon of a chilly day in February, two gentlemen were sitting alone over their wine in a well-furnished dining parlor in the town of P in Kentucky. There were no servants present, and the gentlemen, with chairs closely approaching, seemed to be discussing some subject with great earnestness. For convenience' sake we have said hitherto two gentlemen. One of the parties, however, when critically examined, did not seem, strictly speaking, to come under the species. He was a short, thick-set man, with coarse, commonplace features, and that swaggering air of pretension which marks a low man who is trying to elbow his way upward in the world. He was much overdressed, in a gaudy vest of many colors, a blue neckerchief, bedropped gaily with yellow spots, and arranged with a flaunting tie, quite in keeping with the general air of the man. His hands, large and coarse, were plentifully bedecked with rings, and he wore a heavy gold watch-chain, with a bundle of seals of portentous size, and a great variety of colors attached to it, which, in the ardor of conversation, he was in the habit of flourishing and jingling with evident satisfaction. His conversation was in free and easy defiance of Murray's grammar. English Grammar, 1795, by Lindley Murray, 1745 to 1826, the most authoritative American grammarian of his day, and was garnished at convenient intervals with various profane expressions, which not even the desire to be graphic in our account shall induce us to transcribe. His companion, Mr. Shelby, had the appearance of a gentleman, and the arrangements of the house and the general air of the housekeeping indicated easy and even opulent circumstances. As we before stated, the two were in the midst of an earnest conversation. "That is the way I should arrange the matter," said Mr. Shelby. "I can't make trade that way, I positively can't, Mr. Shelby," said the other, holding up a glass of wine between his eye and the light. "Why, the fact is, Haley, Tom is an uncommon fellow. He is certainly worth that sum anywhere, steady, honest, capable, manages my whole farm like a clock." "You mean honest as niggers go," said Haley, helping himself to a glass of brandy. "No, I mean really, Tom is a good, steady, sensible, pious fellow. He got religion at a camp meeting 4 years ago, and I believe he really did get it. I've trusted him, since then, with everything I have, money, house, horses, and let him come and go round the country, and I always found him true and square in everything." "Some folks don't believe there is pious niggers, Shelby," said Haley, with a candid flourish of his hand, "but I do. I had a fellow, now, in this yer last lot I took to Orleans. 'Twas as good as a meetin', now, really, to hear that critter pray, and he was quite gentle and quiet like. He fetched me a good sum, too, for I bought him cheap of a man that was 'bliged to sell out, so I realized $600 on him. Yes, I consider religion a valuable thing in a nigger, when it's the genuine article, and no mistake." "Well, Tom's got the real article, if ever a fellow had," rejoined the other. "Why, last fall I let him go to Cincinnati alone, to do business for me, and bring home $500. 'Tom,' says I to him, 'I trust you, because I think you're a Christian. I know you wouldn't cheat.' Tom comes back, sure enough. I knew he would. Some low fellows, they say, said to him, 'Tom, why don't you make tracks for Canada?' Master trusted me, and I couldn't. They told me about it. I am sorry to part with Tom, I must say. You ought to let him cover the whole balance of the debt, and you would, Haley, if you had any conscience." "Well, I've got just as much conscience as any man in business can afford to keep. Just a little, you know, to swear by, as 'twere," said the trader, jocularly. And then I'm ready to do anything in reason to oblige friends, but this, you see, is a leetle too hard on a fellow. A leetle too hard." The trader sighed contemplatively and poured out some more brandy. "Well, then, Haley, how will you trade?" said Mr. Shelby, after an uneasy interval of silence. "Well, haven't you a boy or gal that you could throw in with Tom?" "None that I could well spare. To tell the truth, it's only hard necessity makes me willing to sell at all. I don't like parting with any of my hands, that's fact." Here the door opened, and a small quadroon boy, between 4 and 5 years of age, entered the room. There was something in his appearance remarkably beautiful and engaging. His black hair, fine as floss silk, hung in glossy curls about his round, dimpled face, while a pair of large, dark eyes, full of fire and softness, looked out from beneath the rich, long lashes as he peered curiously into the apartment. A gay robe of scarlet and yellow plaid, carefully made and neatly fitted, set off to advantage the dark and rich style of his beauty, and a certain comic air of assurance, blended with bashfulness, showed that he had been not unused to being petted and noticed by his master. "Hello, Jim Crow," said Mr. Shelby, whistling and snapping a bunch of raisins towards him. "Pick that up, now." The child scampered, with all his little strength, after the prize, while his master laughed. "Come here, Jim Crow," said he. The child came up, and the master patted the curly head and chucked him under the chin. "Now, Jim, show this gentleman how you can dance and sing." The boy commenced one of those wild, grotesque songs common among the negroes, in a rich, clear voice, accompanying his singing with many comic evolutions of the hands, feet, and whole body, in all perfect time to the music. "Bravo!" said Haley, throwing him a quarter of an orange. "Now, Jim, walk like old Uncle Cudjoe when he has the rheumatism," said his master. Instantly the flexible limbs of the child assumed the appearance of deformity and distortion, as, with his back humped up and his master's stick in his hand, he hobbled about the room, his childish face drawn into a doleful pucker, and spitting from right to left in imitation of an old man. Both gentlemen laughed uproariously. "Now, Jim," said his master, "show us how old Elder Robbins leads the psalm." The boy drew his chubby face down to a formidable length, and commenced toning a psalm tune through his nose with imperturbable gravity. "Hurrah! Bravo! What a young 'un!" said Haley. "That chap's a case, I'll promise. Tell you what," he said, suddenly clapping his hand on Mr. Shelby's shoulder, "fling in that chap, and I'll settle the business, I will. Come, now, if that ain't doing the thing up about the rightest." At this moment the door was pushed gently open, and a young quadroon woman, apparently about 25, entered the room. There needed only a glance from the child to her to identify her as its mother. There was the same rich, full, dark eye, with its long lashes; the same ripples of silky black hair. The brown of her complexion gave way on the cheek to a perceptible flush, which deepened as she saw the gaze of the strange man fixed upon her in bold and undisguised admiration. Her dress was of the neatest possible fit, and set off to advantage her finely molded shape. A delicately formed hand and a trim foot and ankle were items of appearance that did not escape the quick eye of the trader, well used to run up at a glance the points of a fine female article. "Well, Eliza?" said her master, as she stopped and looked hesitatingly at him. "I was looking for Harry, please, sir." And the boy bounded toward her, showing his spoils, which he had gathered in the skirt of his robe. "Well, take him away, then," said Mr. Shelby, and hastily she withdrew, carrying the child on her arm. "By Jupiter," said the trader, turning to him in admiration, "there's an article, now! You might make your fortune on that ar gal in Orleans, any day. I've seen over 1,000 in my day paid down for gals not a bit handsomer." "I don't want to make my fortune on her," said Mr. Shelby, dryly, and seeking to turn the conversation, he uncorked a bottle of fresh wine and asked his companion's opinion of it. "Capital, sir, first chop," said the trader. Then turning, and slapping his hand familiarly on Shelby's shoulder, he added, "Come, how will you trade about the gal? What shall I say for her? What'll you take?" "Mr. Haley, "She is not to be sold," said Shelby. "My wife would not part with her for her weight in gold." "Aye, aye. Women always say such things, 'cause they hadn't no sort of calculation. Just show 'em how many watches, feathers, and trinkets one's weight in gold would buy, and that alters the case, I reckon." "I tell you, Haley, this must not be spoken of. I say no, and I mean no," said Shelby, decidedly. "Well, you'll let me have the boy, though," said the trader. "You must own I've come down pretty handsomely for him." "What on earth can you want with the child?" said Shelby. "Why, I've got a friend that's going into this yar branch of the business. Wants to buy up handsome boys to raise for the market. Fancy articles entirely. Sell for waiters and so on, to rich uns that can pay for handsome ones. It sets off one of your great places, a real handsome boy to open door, wait, and tend. They fetch a good sum, and this little devil is such a comical musical concern, he's just the article." "I would rather not sell him," said Mr. Shelby, thoughtfully. "The fact is, sir, I'm a humane man, and I hate to take the boy from his mother, sir." "Oh, you do? La, yes, something of that are natter. I understand perfectly. It is mighty onpleasant getting on with women sometimes. I allus hates these yar screechin', screamin' times. They are mighty onpleasant. But as I manages business, I generally avoids 'em, sir. Now, what if you get the girl off for a day or a week or so? Then the thing's done quietly, all over before she comes home. Your wife might get her some earrings or a new gown or some such truck, to make up with her." "I'm afraid not." "Lor bless you, yes. These critters ain't like white folks, you know. They gets over things, only managed right. Now, they say," said Haley, assuming a candid and confidential air, "that this kind of trade is hardening to the feelings. But I never found it so. Fact is, I never could do things up the way some fellers manage the business. I've seen 'em as would pull a woman's child out of her arms and set him up to sell, and she's screeching like mad all the time. Very bad policy. Damages the article. Makes 'em quite unfit for service sometimes. I knew a real handsome gal once in Orleans as was entirely ruined by this sort of handling. The fellow that was trading for her didn't want her baby, and she was one of your real high sort when her blood was up. I tell you, she squeezed up her child in her arms, and talked and went on real awful. It kinder makes my blood run cold to think of it. And when they carried off the child and locked her up, she just went raving mad and died in a week. Clear waste, sir, of $1,000, just for want of management. There's where 'tis. It's always best to do the humane thing, sir. That's been my experience." And the trader leaned back in his chair and folded his arm with an air of virtuous decision, apparently considering himself a second Wilberforce. The subject appeared to interest the gentleman deeply, for while Mr. Shelby was thoughtfully peeling an orange, Haley broke out afresh, with becoming diffidence, but as if actually driven by the force of truth to say a few words more. "It don't look well now for a feller to be praising himself, but I say it just because it's the truth. I believe I'm reckoned to bring in about the finest droves of niggers that is brought in. At least I've been told so. If I have once, I reckon I have 100 times, all in good case, fat and likely, and I lose as few as any man in the business. And I lays it all to my management, sir, and humanity, sir, I may say, is the great pillar of my management." Mr. Shelby did not know what to say, and so he said, "Indeed." "Now, I've been laughed at for my notions, sir, and I've been talked to. They ain't poplar, and they ain't common, but I stuck to 'em, sir. I've stuck to 'em, and realized well on 'em. Yes, sir, they have paid their passage, I may say," and the trader laughed at his joke. There was something so piquant and original in these elucidations of humanity that Mr. Shelby could not help laughing in company. Perhaps you laugh too, dear reader, but you know humanity comes out in a variety of strange forms nowadays, and there is no end to the odd things that humane people will say and do. Mr. Shelby's laugh encouraged the trader to proceed. "It's strange, now, but I never could beat this into people's heads. Now, there was Tom Loker, my old partner, down in Natchez.
He was a clever fellow, Tom was, only the very devil with niggers. On principle 'twas, you see, for a better-hearted feller never broke bread. 'Twas his system, sir. I used to talk to Tom. "Why, Tom," I used to say, "when your gals take on and cry, what's the use of cracking on 'em over the head and knocking on 'em round? It's ridiculous," says I, "and don't do no sort of good. Why, I don't see no harm in their crying," says I. "It's nater," says I, "and if nater can't blow off one way it will another. Besides, Tom," says I, "it just spiles your gals. They get sickly and down in the mouth, and sometimes they gets ugly, particular yallow gals do, and it's the devil and all getting on 'em broke in. Now," says I, "why can't you kinder coax 'em up and speak 'em fair? Depend on it, Tom, a little humanity thrown in along goes a heap further than all your jawing and cracking, and it pays better," says I. "Depend on it." But Tom couldn't get the hang on it, and he spiled so many for me that I had to break off with him, though he was a good-hearted fellow and as fair a business hand as is going.
"And do you find your ways of managing do the business better than Tom's?" said Mr. Shelby.
"Why, yes, sir, I may say so. You see, when I anyways can, I takes a leetle care about the onpleasant parts, like selling young'uns and that. Get the gals out of the way, out of sight, out of mind, you know, and when it's clean done and can't be helped, they naturally gets used to it. 'Tain't, you know, as if it was white folks that's brought up in the way of 'spected to keep their children and wives and all that. Niggers, you know, that's fetched up properly, han't no kind of 'spectations of no kind, so all these things comes easier."
"I'm afraid mine are not properly brought up, then," said Mr. Shelby.
"S'pose not. You Kentucky folks spile your niggers. You mean well by 'em, but 'tain't no real kindness after all. Now, a nigger, you see, what's got to be hacked and tumbled around the world and sold to Tom and Dick and the Lord knows who, 'tain't no kindness to be giving on him notions and expectations and bringing on him up too well, for the rough and tumble comes all the harder on him arter. Now, I venture to say your niggers would be quite chop-fallen in a place where some of your plantation niggers would be singing and whooping like all possessed. Every man, you know, Mr. Shelby, naturally thinks well on his own ways, and I think I treat niggers just about as well as it's ever worth while to treat 'em."
"It's a happy thing to be satisfied," said Mr. Shelby, with a slight shrug, and some perceptible feelings of a disagreeable nature.
"Well," said Haley, after they had both silently picked their nuts for a season, "what do you say?"
"I'll think the matter over and talk with my wife," said Mr. Shelby. "Meantime, Haley, if you want the matter carried on in the quiet way you speak of, you'd best not let your business in this neighborhood be known. It will get out among my boys, and it will not be a particularly quiet business getting away any of my fellows, if they know it, I'll promise you."
"Oh, certainly, by all means, mum, of course. But I'll tell you, I'm in a devil of a hurry, and shall want to know as soon as possible what I may depend on," said he, rising and putting on his overcoat.
"Well, call up this evening between 6 and 7, and you shall have my answer," said Mr. Shelby, and the trader bowed himself out of the apartment. "I'd like to have been able to kick the fellow down the steps," said he to himself, as he saw the door fairly closed, "with his impudent assurance. But he knows how much he has me at advantage. If anybody had ever said to me that I should sell Tom down south to one of those rascally traders, I should have said, 'Is thy servant a dog, that he should do this thing?' And now it must come, for aught I see. And Eliza's child, too. I know that I shall have some fuss with wife about that, and for that matter about Tom, too. So much for being in debt. Hey ho! The fellow sees his advantage, and means to push it." Perhaps the mildest form of the system of slavery is to be seen in the State of Kentucky. The general prevalence of agricultural pursuits of a quiet and gradual nature, not requiring those periodic seasons of hurry and pressure that are called for in the business of more southern districts, makes the task of the negro a more healthful and reasonable one; while the master, content with a more gradual style of acquisition, has not those temptations to hard-heartedness which always overcome frail human nature when the prospect of sudden and rapid gain is weighed in the balance, with no heavier counterpoise than the interests of the helpless and unprotected. Whoever visits some estates there and witnesses the good-humored indulgence of some masters and mistresses, and the affectionate loyalty of some slaves, might be tempted to dream the oft-fabled poetic legend of a patriarchal institution, and all that. But over and above the scene there broods a portentous shadow, the shadow of law. So long as the law considers all these human beings, with beating hearts and living affections, only as so many things belonging to a master, so long as the failure, or misfortune, or imprudence, or death of the kindest owner may cause them any day to exchange a life of kind protection and indulgence for one of hopeless misery and toil, so long it is impossible to make anything beautiful or desirable in the best regulated administration of slavery. Mr. Shelby was a fair average kind of man, good-natured and kindly, and disposed to easy indulgence of those around him, and there had never been a lack of anything which might contribute to the physical comfort of the negroes on his estate. He had, however, speculated largely and quite loosely, had involved himself deeply, and his notes, to a large amount, had come into the hands of Haley, and this small piece of information is the key to the preceding conversation. Now, it had so happened that, in approaching the door, Eliza had caught enough of the conversation to know that a trader was making offers to her master for somebody. She would gladly have stopped at the door to listen as she came out, but her mistress just then calling, she was obliged to hasten away. Still, she thought she heard the trader make an offer for her boy. Could she be mistaken? Her heart swelled and throbbed, and she involuntarily strained him so tight that the little fellow looked up into her face in astonishment. "Eliza, girl, what ails you today?" said her mistress, when Eliza had upset the wash-pitcher, knocked down the workstand, and finally was abstractedly offering her mistress a long nightgown in place of the silk dress she had ordered her to bring from the wardrobe. Eliza started. "Oh, missus," she said, raising her eyes. Then, bursting into tears, she sat down in a chair and began sobbing. "Why, Eliza, child, what ails you?" said her mistress. "Oh, missus," said Eliza, "there's been a trader talking with master in the parlor. I heard him." "Well, silly child, suppose there was." "Oh, missus, do you suppose master would sell my Harry?" And the poor creature threw herself into a chair and sobbed convulsively. "Sell him? No, you foolish girl. You know your master never deals with those Southern traders, and never means to sell any of his servants, as long as they behave well. Why, you silly child, who do you think would want to buy your Harry? Do you think all the world are set on him as you are, you goosey? Come, cheer up and hook my dress. There now, put my back hair up in that pretty braid you learnt the other day, and don't go listening at doors any more." "Well, but, missus, you never would give your consent to "Nonsense, child. To be sure I shouldn't. What do you talk so for? I would as soon have one of my own children sold. But really, Eliza, you are getting altogether too proud of that little fellow. A man can't put his nose into the door, but you think he must be coming to buy him." Reassured by her mistress's confident tone, Eliza proceeded nimbly and adroitly with her toilet, laughing at her own fears as she proceeded. Mrs. Shelby was a woman of high class, both intellectually and morally. To that natural magnanimity and generosity of mind which one often marks as characteristic of the women of Kentucky, she added high moral and religious sensibility and principle, carried out with great energy and ability into practical results. Her husband, who made no professions to any particular religious character, nevertheless reverenced and respected the consistency of hers, and stood, perhaps, a little in awe of her opinion. Certain it was that he gave her unlimited scope in all her benevolent efforts for the comfort, instruction, and improvement of her servants, though he never took any decided part in them himself. In fact, if not exactly a believer in the doctrine of the efficiency of the extra good works of saints, he really seemed somehow or other to fancy that his wife had piety and benevolence enough for two, to indulge a shadowy expectation of getting into heaven through her superabundance of qualities, to which he made no particular pretension. The heaviest load on his mind, after his conversation with the trader, lay in the foreseen necessity of breaking to his wife the arrangement contemplated, meeting the importunities and opposition which he knew he should have reason to encounter. Mrs. Shelby, being entirely ignorant of her husband's embarrassments, and knowing only the general kindliness of his temper, had been quite sincere in the entire incredulity with which she had met Eliza's suspicions. In fact, she dismissed the matter from her mind, without a second thought, and, being occupied in preparations for an evening visit, it passed out of her thoughts entirely. End of Chapter 1. Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 2. The Mother. Eliza had been brought up by her mistress, from girlhood, as a petted and indulged favorite. The traveler in the South must often have remarked that peculiar air of refinement, that softness of voice and manner, which seems in many cases to be a particular gift to the quadroon and mulatto women. These natural graces in the quadroon are often united with beauty of the most dazzling kind, and in almost every case with a personal appearance prepossessing and agreeable. Eliza, such as we have described her, is not a fancy sketch, but taken from remembrance as we saw her years ago in Kentucky. Safe under the protecting care of her mistress, Eliza had reached maturity without those temptations which make beauty so fatal an inheritance to a slave. She had been married to a bright and talented young mulatto man who was a slave on a neighboring estate, and bore the name of George Harris. This young man had been hired out by his master to work in a bagging factory, where his adroitness and ingenuity caused him to be considered the first hand in the place. He had invented a machine for the cleaning of the hemp, which, considering the education and circumstances of the inventor, displayed quite as much mechanical genius as Whitney's cotton gin. Note: a machine of this description was really the invention of a young colored man in Kentucky. Mrs. Stowe's note. He was possessed of a handsome person and pleasing manners, and was a general favorite in the factory. Nevertheless, as this young man was in the eye of the law not a man but a thing, all these superior qualifications were subject to the control of a vulgar, narrow-minded, tyrannical master. This same gentleman, having heard of the fame of George's invention, took a ride over to the factory to see what this intelligent chattel had been about. He was received with great enthusiasm by the employer, who congratulated him on possessing so valuable a slave. He was waited upon over the factory, shown the machinery by George, who in high spirits talked so fluently, held himself so erect, looked so handsome and manly, that his master began to feel an uneasy consciousness of inferiority. What business had this slave to be marching round the country, inventing machines, and holding up his head among gentlemen? He'd soon put a stop to it. He'd take him back and put him to hoeing and digging, and
see if he'd step about so smart.
Accordingly, the manufacturer and all hands concerned were astounded when he suddenly demanded George's wages and announced his intention of taking him home.
"But, Mr. Harris," remonstrated the manufacturer, "isn't this rather sudden? What if it is? Isn't the man mine?"
"We would be willing, sir, to increase the rate of compensation."
"No object at all, sir. I don't need to hire any of my hands out, unless I've a mind to."
"But, sir, he seems peculiarly adapted to this business."
"Dare say he may be. Never was much adapted to anything that I set him about, I'll be bound."
"But only think of his inventing this machine," interposed one of the workmen, rather unluckily.
"Oh, yes, a machine for saving work, is it? He'd invent that, I'll be bound. Let a nigger alone for that any time. They are all labor-saving machines themselves, every one of them. No, he shall tramp."
George had stood like one transfixed at hearing his doom thus suddenly pronounced by a power that he knew was irresistible. He folded his arms, tightly pressed in his lips, but a whole volcano of bitter feelings burned in his bosom and sent streams of fire through his veins. He breathed short, and his large dark eyes flashed like live coals, and he might have broken out into some dangerous ebullition had not the kindly manufacturer touched him on the arm and said in a low tone, "Give way, George. Go with him for the present. We'll try to help you yet." The tyrant observed the whisper, and conjectured its import, though he could not hear what was said, and he inwardly strengthened himself in his determination to keep the power he possessed over his victim. George was taken home and put to the meanest drudgery of the farm. He had been able to repress every disrespectful word, but the flashing eye, the gloomy and troubled brow, were part of a natural language that could not be repressed, indubitable signs which showed too plainly that the man could not become a thing. It was during the happy period of his employment in the factory that George had seen and married his wife. During that period, being much trusted and favored by his employer, he had free liberty to come and go at discretion. The marriage was highly approved of by Mrs. Shelby, who, with a little womanly complacency in matchmaking, felt pleased to unite her handsome favorite with one of her own class who seemed in every way suited to her; and so they were married in her mistress's great parlor, and her mistress herself adorned the bride's beautiful hair with orange blossoms, and threw over it the bridal veil, which certainly could scarce have rested on a fairer head. And there was no lack of white gloves, and cake and wine, of admiring guests to praise the bride's beauty, and her mistress's indulgence and liberality. For a year or two Eliza saw her husband frequently, and there was nothing to interrupt their happiness except the loss of 2 infant children, to whom she was passionately attached, and whom she mourned with a grief so intense as to call for gentle remonstrance from her mistress, who sought, with maternal anxiety, to direct her naturally passionate feelings within the bounds of reason and religion. After the birth of little Harry, however, she had gradually become tranquilized and settled, and every bleeding tie and throbbing nerve, once more entwined with that little life, seemed to become sound and healthful, and Eliza was a happy woman up to the time that her husband was rudely torn from his kind employer and brought under the iron sway of his legal owner. The manufacturer, true to his word, visited Mr. Harris a week or 2 after George had been taken away, when, as he hoped, the heat of the occasion had passed away, and tried every possible inducement to lead him to restore him to his former employment.
"You needn't trouble yourself to talk any longer," said he, doggedly. "I know my own business, sir."
"I did not presume to interfere with it, sir. I only thought that you might think it for your interest to let your man to us on the terms proposed."
"Oh, I understand the matter well enough. I saw your winking and whispering the day I took him out of the factory. But you don't come it over me that way. It's a free country, sir. The man's mine, and I do what I please with him. That's it."
And so fell George's last hope. Nothing before him but a life of toil and drudgery, rendered more bitter by every little smarting vexation and indignity which tyrannical ingenuity could devise. A very humane jurist once said, "The worst use you can put a man to is to hang him." No, there is another use that a man can be put to that is worse. End of chapter 2. Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 3. The Husband and Father. Mrs. Shelby had gone on her visit, and Eliza stood in the veranda, rather dejectedly looking after the retreating carriage, when a hand was laid on her shoulder. She turned, and a bright smile lighted up her fine eyes. "George, is it you? How you frightened me! Well, I am so glad you's come. Missus is gone to spend the afternoon, so come into my little room, and we'll have this time all to ourselves." Saying this, she drew him into a neat little apartment opening on the veranda, where she generally sat at her sewing, within call of her mistress. "How glad I am! Why don't you smile? And look at Harry, how he grows!" The boy stood shyly regarding his father through his curls, holding close to the skirts of his mother's dress. "Isn't he beautiful?" said Eliza, lifting his long curls and kissing him.
"I wish he'd never been born," said George bitterly. "I wish I'd never been born myself."
Surprised and frightened, Eliza sat down, leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, and burst into tears. "There now, Eliza, it's too bad for me to make you feel so, poor girl," said he, fondly. "It's too bad. Oh, how I wish you never had seen me. You might have been happy."
"George, George, how can you talk so? What dreadful thing has happened, or is going to happen? I'm sure we've been very happy till lately."
"So we have, dear," said George. Then, drawing his child on his knee, he gazed intently on his glorious dark eyes, and passed his hands through his long curls. "Just like you, Eliza. And you are the handsomest woman I ever saw, and the best one I ever wish to see. But, oh, I wish I'd never seen you, nor you me."
"Oh, George, how can you?"
"Yes, Eliza, it's all misery, misery, misery. My life is bitter as wormwood. The very life is burning out of me. I'm a poor, miserable, forlorn drudge. I shall only drag you down with me, that's all. What's the use of our trying to do anything, trying to know anything, trying to be anything? What's the use of living? I wish I was dead."
"Oh, now, dear George, that is really wicked. I know how you feel about losing your place in the factory, and you have a hard master. But pray be patient, and perhaps something—"
"Patient?" said he, interrupting her. "Haven't I been patient? Did I say a word when he came and took me away, for no earthly reason, from the place where everybody was kind to me? I paid him truly every cent of my earnings, and they all say I worked well."
"Well, it is dreadful," said Eliza. "But after all, he is your master, you know."
"My master? And who made him my master? That's what I think of. What right has he to me? I'm a man as much as he is. I'm a better man than he is. I know more about business than he does. I am a better manager than he is. I can read better than he can, I can write a better hand, and I've learned it all myself, and no thanks to him. I've learned it in spite of him. And now what right has he to make a dray horse of me, to take me from things I can do, and do better than he can, and put me to work that any horse can do? He tries to do it. He says he'll bring me down and humble me, and he puts me to just the hardest, meanest, and dirtiest work on purpose."
"Oh, George, George, you frighten me. Why, I never heard you talk so. I'm afraid you'll do something dreadful. I don't wonder at your feelings at all, but oh, do be careful, do for my sake, for Harry's."
"I have been careful, and I have been patient, but it's growing worse and worse. Flesh and blood can't bear it any longer. Every chance he can get to insult and torment me, he takes. I thought I could do my work well, and keep on quiet, and have some time to read and learn out of work hours, but the more he see I can do, the more he loads on. He says that, though I don't say anything, he sees I got the devil in me, and he means to bring it out, and one of these days it will come out in a way that he won't like, or I'm mistaken."
"Oh, dear, what shall we do?" said Eliza, mournfully.
"It was only yesterday," said George, "as I was busy loading stones into a cart, that young Massa Tom stood there, slashing his whip so near the horse that the creature was frightened. I asked him to stop, as pleasant as I could. He just kept right on. I begged him again, and then he turned on me and began striking me. I held his hand, and then he screamed and kicked and ran to his father and told him that I was fighting him. He came in a rage and said he'd teach me who was my master, and he tied me to a tree and cut switches for young master and told him that he might whip me till he was tired, and he did do it. If I don't make him remember it sometime." And the brow of the young man grew dark, and his eyes burned with an expression that made his young wife tremble. "Who made this man my master? That's what I want to know," he said.
"Well," said Eliza, mournfully, "I always thought that I must obey my master and mistress, or I couldn't be a Christian."
"There is some sense in it, in your case. They have brought you up like a child, fed you, clothed you, indulged you, and taught you, so that you have a good education. That is some reason why they should claim you. But I have been kicked and cuffed and sworn at, and at the best only let alone. And what do I owe? I've paid for all my keeping 100 times over. I won't bear it. No, I won't," he said, clenching his hand with a fierce frown. Eliza trembled and was silent. She had never seen her husband in this mood before, and her gentle system of ethics seemed to bend like a reed in the surges of such passion.
"You know poor little Carlo that you gave me?" added George. "The creature has been about all the comfort that I've had. He has slept with me nights, and followed me around days, and kind of looked at me as if he understood how I felt. Well, the other day I was just feeding him with a few old scraps I picked up by the kitchen door, and Massa came along and said I was feeding him up at his expense, and that he couldn't afford to have every nigger keeping his dog, and ordered me to tie a stone to his neck and throw him into the pond."
"Oh, George, you didn't do it."
"Do it? Not I, but he did. Massa and Tom pelted the poor drowning creature with stones. Poor thing, he looked at me so mournful as if he wondered why I didn't save him. I had to take a flogging because I wouldn't do it myself. I don't care. Massa will find out that I'm one that whipping won't tame. My day will come yet, if he don't look out."
"What are you going to do? Oh, George, don't do anything wicked. If you only trust in God and try to do right, He'll deliver you."
"I ain't a Christian like you, Eliza. My heart's full of bitterness. I can't trust in God. Why does He let things be so?"
"Oh, George, we must have faith. Mistress says that when all things go wrong to us, we must believe that God is doing the very best."
"That's easy to say for people that are sitting on their sofas and riding in their carriages, but let 'em be where I am, I guess it would come some harder. I wish I could be good, but my heart burns and can't be reconciled anyhow. You couldn't in my place. You can't now, if I tell you all I've got to say. You don't know the whole yet."
"What can be coming now?"
"Well, lately Massa's been saying that he was a fool to let me marry off the place, and that he hates Mr. Shelby and all his tribe because they are proud and hold their heads up above him, and that I've got proud notions from you, and he says he won't let me come here any more, and that I shall take a wife and settle down on his place. At first he only scolded and grumbled these things, but yesterday he told me that I should take Mina for a wife and settle down in a cabin with her, or he would sell me down river."
"Why, but you were married to me, by the minister, as much as if you'd been a white man," said Eliza simply.
"Don't you know a slave can't be married? There is no law in this country for that. I can't hold you for my wife if he chooses to part us. That's why I wish I'd never seen you. Why I wish I'd never been born. It would have been better for us both. It would have been better for this poor child if he had never been born. All this may happen to him yet."
"Oh, but master is so kind."
"Yes, but who knows? He may die, and then he may be sold to nobody knows who. What pleasure is it that he is handsome and smart and bright? I tell you, Eliza, that a sword will pierce through your soul for every good and pleasant thing your child is or has. It will make him worth too much for you to keep."
The words smote heavily on Eliza's heart. The vision of the trader came before her eyes, and as if someone had struck her a deadly blow, she turned pale and gasped for breath. She looked nervously out on the veranda where the boy, tired of the grave conversation, had retired, and where he was riding triumphantly up and down on Mr. Shelby's walking-stick. He would have spoken to tell her husband her fears, but checked herself.
"No, no, he has enough to bear, poor fellow," she thought. "No, I won't tell him. Besides, it ain't true. Mrs. never deceives us."
"So, Eliza, my girl," said the husband mournfully, "bear up now, and good-bye, for I'm going."
"Going, George? Going where?"
"To Canada," said he, straightening himself up, "and when I'm there I'll buy you. That's all the hope that's left us. You have a kind master that won't refuse to sell you. I'll buy you and the boy. God helping me, I will."
"Oh, dreadful! If you should be taken?"
"I won't be taken, Eliza. I'll die first. I'll be free or I'll die."
"You won't kill yourself?"
"No need of that. They will kill me fast enough. They never will get me down the river alive."
"Oh, George, for my sake, do be careful. Don't do anything wicked. Don't lay hands on yourself or anybody else. You are tempted too much, too much. But don't. Go you must, but go carefully, prudently. Pray God to help you."
"Well, then, Eliza, hear my plan.
Massa took it into his head to send me right by here with a note to Mr. Symes, that lives a mile past. I believe he expected I should come here to tell you what I have. It would please him if he thought it would aggravate Shelby's folks, as he calls 'em. I'm going home quite resigned, you understand, as if all was over. I've got some preparations made, and there are those that will help me, and in the course of a week or so I shall be among the missing some day. Pray for me, Eliza. Perhaps the good Lord will hear you." "Oh, pray yourself, George, and go trusting in him. Then you won't do anything wicked." "Well, now, good-bye," said George, holding Eliza's hands and gazing into her eyes without moving. They stood silent. Then there were last words, and sobs, and bitter weeping. Such parting as those may make whose hope to meet again is as the spider's web, and the husband and wife were parted. End of chapter 3. Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 4. An Evening in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The cabin of Uncle Tom was a small log building close adjoining to the house, as the negro par excellence designates his master's dwelling. In front it had a neat garden patch where, every summer, strawberries, raspberries, and a variety of fruits and vegetables flourished under careful tending. The whole front of it was covered by a large scarlet bignonia and a native multiflora rose, which, in twisting and interlacing, left scarce a vestige of the rough logs to be seen. Here also in summer various brilliant annuals, such as marigolds, petunias, 4-o'clocks, found an indulgent corner in which to unfold their splendors, and were the delight and pride of Aunt Chloe's heart. Let us enter the dwelling. The evening meal at the house is over, and Aunt Chloe, who presided over its preparations as head cook, has left to inferior officers in the kitchen the business of clearing away and washing dishes, and come out into her own snug territories to get her old man's supper. Therefore doubt not that it is her you see by the fire, presiding with anxious interest over certain frizzling items in a stew-pan, and anon, with grave consideration, lifting the cover of a bake-kettle, from whence steam forth indubitable intimations of something good. A round, black, shining face is hers, so glossy as to suggest the idea that she might have been washed over with white of eggs, like one of her own tea-rusks. Her whole plump countenance beams with satisfaction and contentment from under her well-starched checked turban, bearing on it, however, if we must confess it, a little of that tinge of self-consciousness which becomes the first cook of the neighborhood, as Aunt Chloe was universally held and acknowledged to be. A cook she certainly was, in the very bone and center of her soul. Not a chicken or turkey or duck in the barnyard but looked grave when they saw her approaching, and seemed evidently to be reflecting on their latter end, and certain it was that she was always meditating on trussing, stuffing, and roasting, to a degree that was calculated to inspire terror in any reflecting fowl living. Her corn cake, in all its varieties of hoe cake, dodgers, muffins, and other species too numerous to mention, was a sublime mystery to all less practised compounders, and she would shake her fat sides with honest pride and merriment as she would narrate the fruitless efforts that one and another of her compeers had made to attain to her elevation. The arrival of company at the house, the arranging of dinners and suppers in style, awoke all the energies of her soul, and no sight was more welcome to her than a pile of traveling trunks launched on the veranda, for then she foresaw fresh efforts and fresh triumphs. Just at present, however, Aunt Chloe is looking into the bake-pan, in which congenial operation we shall leave her till we finish our picture of the cottage. In one corner of it stood a bed, covered neatly with a snowy spread, and by the side of it was a piece of carpeting of some considerable size. On this piece of carpeting Aunt Chloe took her stand, as being decidedly in the upper walks of life.
and it and the bed by which it lay, and the whole corner, in fact, were treated with distinguished consideration, and made, so far as possible, sacred from the marauding inroads and desecrations of little folks. In fact, that corner was the drawing-room of the establishment. In the other corner was a bed of much humbler pretensions, and evidently designed for use. The wall over the fireplace was adorned with some very brilliant scriptural prints, and a portrait of General Washington, drawn and colored in a manner which would certainly have astonished that hero, if ever he happened to meet with its like. On a rough bench in the corner, a couple of woolly-headed boys, with glistening black eyes and fat shining cheeks, were busy in superintending the first walking operations of the baby, which, as is usually the case, consisted in getting up on its feet, balancing a moment, and then tumbling down, each successive failure being violently cheered as something decidedly clever. A table, somewhat rheumatic in its limbs, was drawn out in front of the fire, and covered with a cloth, displaying cups and saucers of a decidedly brilliant pattern, with other symptoms of an approaching meal. At this table was seated Uncle Tom, Mr. Shelby's best hand, who, as he is to be the hero of our story, we must daguerreotype for our readers. He was a large, broad-chested, powerfully made man, of a full glossy black, and a face whose truly African features were characterized by an expression of grave and steady good sense, united with much kindliness and benevolence. There was something about his whole air self-respecting and dignified, yet united with a confiding and humble simplicity. He was very busy at this moment on a slate lying before him, on which he was carefully and slowly endeavoring to accomplish a copy of some letters, in which operation he was overlooked by young Master George, a smart, bright boy of 13, who appeared fully to realize the dignity of his position as instructor. "Not that way, Uncle Tom, not that way," said he, briskly, as Uncle Tom laboriously brought up the tail of his G the wrong side out. "That makes a Q, you see." "La sakes, now, does it?" said Uncle Tom, looking with a respectful, admiring air as his young teacher flourishingly scrawled Q's and G's innumerable for his edification; and then, taking the pencil in his big, heavy fingers, he patiently recommenced.
"How easy white folks allus does things,"
said Aunt Chloe, pausing while she was greasing a griddle with a scrap of bacon on her fork, and regarding young Master George with pride.
"The way he can write, now, and read, too, and then to come out here evenings and read his lessons to us. It's mighty interesting."
"But, Aunt Chloe, I'm getting mighty hungry," said George. "Isn't that cake in the skillet almost done?"
"Most done, Massa George,"
said Aunt Chloe, lifting the lid and peeping in.
"Browning beautiful, a real lovely brown. Let me alone for that. Missus let Sally try to make some cake t'other day, just to larn her. She said, 'Oh, go way, missus,' said I. 'It really hurts my feelings now to see good vittles spout that our way. Cake rise all to one side, no shape at all, no more than my shoe, go way.'" And with this final expression of contempt for Sally's greenness, Aunt Chloe whipped the cover off the baked kettle, and disclosed to view a neatly baked pound cake, of which no city confectioner need to have been ashamed. This being evidently the central point of the entertainment, Aunt Chloe began now to bustle about earnestly in the supper department. "Here, you Mose and Pete, get out the way, you niggers. Get away, Meriky, honey. Mammy'll give her baby some fin by and by. Now, Massa George, you just take off them books, and set down now with my old man, and I'll take up the sausages, and have the first griddle full of cakes on your plates in less than no time."
"They wanted me to come to dinner in the house," said George, "but I knew what was what too well for that, Aunt Chloe."
So you did, honey,"
said Aunt Chloe, heaping the smoking batter cakes on his plate.
"You knowed your old auntie'd keep the best for you. Oh, let you alone for that, go way."
And with that, Auntie gave George a nudge with her finger, designed to be immensely facetious, and turned again to her griddle with great briskness. "Now for the cake," said Massa George, when the activity of the griddle department had somewhat subsided, and with that the youngster flourished a large knife over the article in question.
La bless you, Mass George, said Aunt Chloe with earnestness, catching his arm, you wouldn't be for cutting it with that ar great heavy knife, smash all down, spiled all the pretty rise of it. Here, I've got a thin old knife I keeps sharp a purpose. Dar now, see, comes apart light as a feather. Now, eat away, you won't get anything to beat that ar.
Tom Lincoln says,
said George, speaking with his mouth full,
that there Ginny is a better cook than you.
Dem Lincolns ain't much count no way, said Aunt Chloe, contemptuously. I mean, set alongside our folks. They 'spectable folks enough in a kinder plain way, but as to getting up anything in style, they don't begin to have a notion on't. Set Master Lincoln, now, alongside Master Shelby. Good Lord! And Mrs. Lincoln, can she kinder sweep it into a room like my missus, so kinder splendid, you know. Oh, go away. Don't tell me nothing of them Lincolns.
And Aunt Chloe tossed her head as one who hoped she did know something of the world.
Well, though, I've heard you say, said George, that Ginny was a pretty fair cook.
So I did, said Aunt Chloe. I may say that. Good, plain, common cooking. Ginny'll do. Make a good pone of bread. Bile her taters far. Her corn cakes isn't extra, not extra now. Ginny's corn cakes isn't, but then they's fire. But, Lord, come to be hired branches, and what can she do? Why, she makes pies. Sartin she does. But what kind of crust? Can she make your real flecky paste, as melts in your mouth and lies all up like a puff? Now, I went over thar when Miss Mary was gwine to be married, and Ginny she just showed me the wedding pies. Ginny and I is good friends, you know. I never said nothing. But go 'long, Master George. Why, I shouldn't sleep a wink for a week if I had a batch of pies like them are. Why, they wa'n't no count 'tall.
I suppose Ginny thought they were ever so nice, said George.
Thought so, didn't she? Thar she was, showing 'em as innocent. You see, it's just here Ginny don't know. Lord, the family ain't nothing. She can't be 'spected to know. 'Tain't no fault of 'em. Oh, Master George, you doesn't know half your privileges in your family in bringing up.
Here Aunt Chloe sighed and rolled up her eyes with emotion.
I'm sure, Aunt Chloe, I understand. My pie and pudding privileges, said George. Ask Tom Lincoln if I don't crow over him every time I meet him.
Aunt Chloe sat back in her chair and indulged in a hearty guffaw of laughter at this witticism of young Masters, laughing till the tears rolled down her black shining cheeks, and varying the exercise with playfully slapping and poking Master Georgie, and telling him to go away, and that he was a case, that he was fit to kill her, and that he sartin would kill her one of these days, and between each of these sanguinary predictions going off into a laugh, each longer and stronger than the other, till George really began to think that he was a very dangerously witty fellow, and that it became him to be careful how he talked, as funny as he could.
And so you yelled, Tom, did you? Oh, Lord, what young'uns will be up to. You crowed over Tom? Oh, Lord. Master George, if you wouldn't make a hornbug laugh.
Yes, said George. I says to him, Tom, you ought to see some of Aunt Chloe's pies. They're the right sort, says I.
Pity now Tom couldn't, said Aunt Chloe, on whose benevolent heart the idea of Tom's benighted condition seemed to make a strong impression.
You oughter just ask him here to dinner some of these times, Master George, she added. It would look quite pretty of you. You know, Master George, you oughtn't feel above nobody on count your privileges, 'cause all our privileges is given to us.
We ought allus to remember that, said Aunt Chloe, looking quite serious.
Well, I mean to ask Tom here some day next week, said George, and you do your prettiest, Aunt Chloe, and we'll make him stare. Won't we make him eat so he won't get over it for a fortnight?
Yes, certain, said Uncle Chloe, delighted. You'll see, Lord, to think of some of our dinners. You mind that our great chicken pie made when we guv the dinner to General Knox? I and Missus, we come pretty near quarreling about that our crust. What does get into ladies sometimes, I don't know. But sometimes, when a body has the heaviest kind of 'sponsibility on 'em, as ye may say, and is all kinder serious and taken up, they takes that our time to be hanging round and kinder interfering. Now, Missus, she wanted me to do this way, and she wanted me to do that way, and finally I got kinder sarsy and says, Now, Missus, Do just look at them beautiful white hands of yourn, with long fingers and all them sparkly with rings, like my white lilies when the dew's on 'em. And look at my great black stumpin' hands. Now, don't you think that the Lord must have meant me to make the pie crust, and you to stay in the parlor? Dar, I was just so sarcy, Master George."
"And what did mother say?" said George.
"Say? Why, she kinder larfed in her eyes, them great handsome eyes of hern. Oh, and says she, 'Well, Aunt Chloe, I think you are about in the right on't,' says she, and she went off in the parlor. She oughter cracked me over the head for being so sarcy, but thar's whar 'tis. I can't do nothing with ladies in the kitchen."
"Well, you made out well with that dinner. I remember everybody said so," said George.
"Didn't I? And wa'n't I behind the dining room door dat berry day? And didn't I see the General pass his plate 3 times for some more dat berry pie? And says he, 'You must have an uncommon cook, Mrs. Shelby.' Lord, I was fit to split myself."
"And the General, he knows what cooking is," said Aunt Chloe, drawing herself up with an air.
"Berry nice man, the General. He comes of one of the berry fustest families in old Virginny. He knows what's what, now, as well as I do, the General. You see, there's p'ints in all pies, Master George, but 'tain't everybody knows what they is, or as orter be. But the General, he knows. I knew by his marks he made. Yes, he knows what the p'ints is."
By this time Master George had arrived at that pass to which even a boy can come, under uncommon circumstances, when he really could not eat another morsel; and, therefore, he was at leisure to notice the pile of woolly heads and glistening eyes which were regarding their operations hungrily from the opposite corner.
"Here, you, Mose, Pete," he said, breaking off liberal bits and throwing it at them. "You want some, don't you? Come, Aunt Chloe, bake them some cakes."
And George and Tom moved to a comfortable seat in the chimney corner, while Aunt Chloe, after baking a goodly pile of cakes, took her baby on her lap, and began alternately filling its mouth and her own, and distributing to Mose and Pete, who seemed rather to prefer eating theirs as they rolled about on the floor under the table, tickling each other, and occasionally pulling the baby's toes.
"Oh, go 'long, will you?"
said the mother, giving now and then a kick in a kind of a general way under the table when the movement became too obstreperous.
"Can't you be decent when white folks comes to see you? Stop that ar, now, will you? Better mind yourselves, or I'll take you down a buttonhole lower when Massa George is gone."
What meaning was couched under this terrible threat, it is difficult to say, but certain it is that its awful indistinctness seemed to produce very little impression on the young sinners addressed.
"Law, now,"
said Uncle Tom,
"they are so full of tickle all the while, they can't behave theirselves."
Here the boys emerged from under the table, and, with hands and faces well plastered with molasses, began a vigorous kissing of the baby.
"Get along with you," said the mother, pushing away their woolly heads. "You'll all stick together and never get clar if you do that fashion. Go along to spring and wash yourselves," she said, seconding her exhortations with a slap which resounded very formidably, but which seemed only to knock out so much more laugh from the young ones as they tumbled precipitately over each other out the doors, where they fairly screamed with merriment. "Did you ever see such aggravating young'uns?"
said Aunt Chloe, rather complacently, as, producing an old towel kept for such emergencies, she poured a little water out of the cracked teapot on it and began rubbing off the molasses from the baby's face and hands. And, having polished her till she shone, she set her down in Tom's lap, while she busied herself in clearing away supper. The baby employed the intervals in pulling Tom's nose, scratching his face, and burying her fat hands in his woolly hair, which last operation seemed to afford her special content.
"Ain't she a pert young'un?"
said Tom, holding her from him to take a full-length view. Then, getting up, he set her on his broad shoulder, and began capering and dancing with her, while Master George snapped at her with his pocket-handkerchief, and Mose and Pete, now returned again, roared after her like bears, till Aunt Chloe declared that they fairly took her head off with their noise. As, according to her own statement, this surgical operation was a matter of daily occurrence in the cabin, the declaration no whit abated the merriment, till every one had roared and tumbled and danced themselves down to a state of composure.
"Well, now, I hopes you're done," said Aunt Chloe, who had been busy in pulling out a rude box of a trundle bed. "And now you and Mose and Pete get into thar, for we's going to have the meeting."
"Oh, Mother, we don't want her. We wants to sit up to meetin'. Meetin' is so cur'us. We likes 'em." "La, Aunt Chloe, shove it under and let 'em sit up," said Master George decisively, giving a push to the rude machine. Aunt Chloe, having thus saved appearances, seemed highly delighted to push the thing under, saying as she did so, "Well, maybe 'twill do 'em some good." The House now resolved itself into a committee of the whole to consider the accommodations and arrangements for the meeting. "What we's to do for cheers now, I declare I don't know," said Aunt Chloe. As the meeting had been held at Uncle Tom's Weekly for an indefinite length of time, without any more cheers, there seemed some encouragement to hope that a way would be discovered at present. "Old Uncle Peter sung both the legs out of that oldest cheer last week," suggested Mose. "You go 'long. I'll bound you pulled 'em out. Some of your shines," said Aunt Chloe. "Well, it'll stand, if it only keeps jam up agin the wall," said Mose. "Then Uncle Peter mustn't sit in it, 'cause he allus hitches when he gets a singin'. He hitched pretty nigh across the room, t'other night," said Pete. "Good Lord, get him in it, then," said Mose. "And then he'd begin, 'Come, saints and sinners, hear me tell,' and then down he'd go." And Mose imitated precisely the nasal tones of the old man tumbling on the floor to illustrate the supposed catastrophe. "Come now, be decent, can't you?" said Aunt Chloe. "Ain't you ashamed?" Master George, however, joined the offender in the laugh, and declared decidedly that Mose was a buster, so the maternal admonition seemed rather to fail of effect. "Well, old man," said Aunt Chloe, "you'll have to tote in them our bar'ls." "Mother's bar'ls is like that ar widder's Master George was readin' 'bout in de good book. Dey never fails," said Mose, aside to Peter. "I'm sure one of 'em caved in last week," said Pete, "and let 'em all down in the middle o' dat singin'. Dat ar was failin', warn't it?" During this aside between Mose and Pete, 2 empty casks had been rolled into the cabin, and being secured from rolling by stones on each side, boards were laid across them, which arrangement, together with the turning down of certain tubs and pails and the disposing of the rickety chairs, at last completed the preparation. "Master George is such a beautiful reader now, I know he'll stay to read for us," said Aunt Chloe. "'Pears like 'twill be so much more interesting." George very readily consented, for your boy is always ready for anything that makes him of importance. The room was soon filled with a motley assemblage, from the old gray-headed patriarch of 80 to the young girl and lad of 15. A little harmless gossip ensued on various themes, such as where old Aunt Sally got her new red headkerchief, and how Missus was going to give Lizzie that spotted muslin gown when she got her new barrage made up, and how Massa Shelby was thinking of buying a new sorrel colt that was going to prove an addition to the glories of the place. A few of the worshippers belonged to families hard by who had got permission to attend, and who brought in various choice scraps of information about the sayings and doings at the house and on the place, which circulated as freely as the same sort of small change does in higher circles. After a while the singing commenced, to the evident delight of all present. Not even all the disadvantage of nasal intonation could prevent the effect of the naturally fine voices in airs at once wild and spirited. The words were sometimes the well-known and common hymns sung in the churches about, and sometimes of a wilder, more indefinite character, picked up at camp meetings. The chorus of one of them, which ran as follows, was sung with great energy and unction: "Die on the field of battle, die on the field of battle, glory in my soul." Another special favorite had oft repeated the words: "Oh, I'm going to glory, won't you come along with me? Don't you see the angels beckoning and calling me away? Don't you see the golden city and the everlasting day?" There were others which made incessant mention of Jordan's banks and Canaan's fields and the New Jerusalem, for the negro mind, impassioned and imaginative, always attaches itself to hymns and expressions of a vivid and pictorial nature; and as they sung, some laughed and some cried, and some clapped hands or shook hands rejoicingly with each other, as if they had fairly gained the other side of the river. Various exhortations or relations of experience followed, and intermingled with the singing. One old gray-headed woman, long past work, but much revered as a sort of chronicle of the past, rose, and leaning on her staff, said: "Well, chil'en, Well, I'm mighty glad to hear y'all and see y'all once more, 'cause I don't know when I'll be gone to glory. But I've done got ready, chillun. 'Pears like I'd got my little bundle all tied up and my bonnet on, just a-waitin' for the stage to come along and take me home. Sometimes in the night I think I hear the wheels a-rattling, and I'm looking out all the time. Now you just be ready, too, for I tell you all, chillun," she said, striking her staff hard on the floor, "dat ar glory is a mighty thing. It's a mighty thing, chillun. You don't know nothing about it. It's wonderful." And the old creature sat down, with streaming tears, as wholly overcome, while the whole circle struck up, "O Canaan, bright Canaan, I'm bound for the land of Canaan." Massa George, by request, read the last chapters of Revelation, often interrupted by such exclamations as, "The sakes now! Only hear that! Just think on't! Is all that a-comin' sure enough?" George, who was a bright boy and well trained in religious things by his mother, finding himself an object of general admiration, threw in expositions of his own from time to time, with a commendable seriousness and gravity, for which he was admired by the young and blessed by the old, and it was agreed on all hands that a minister couldn't lay it off better than he did. That 'twas really 'mazin'. Uncle Tom was a sort of patriarch in religious matters in the neighborhood, having naturally an organization in which the morale was strongly predominant, together with a greater breadth and cultivation of mind than obtained among his companions. He was looked up to with great respect as a sort of minister among them, and the simple, hearty, sincere style of his exhortations might have edified even better educated persons. But it was in prayer that he especially excelled. Nothing could exceed the touching simplicity, the childlike earnestness of his prayer, enriched with the language of Scripture, which seemed so entirely to have wrought itself into his being as to have become a part of himself, and to drop from his lips unconsciously. In the language of a pious old negro, he "prayed right up." And so much did his prayer always work on the devotional feelings of his audiences, that there seemed often a danger that it would be lost altogether in the abundance of the responses which broke out everywhere around him. While this scene was passing in the cabin of the man, one quite otherwise passed in the halls of the master. The trader and Mr. Shelby were seated together in the dining room aforenamed, at a table covered with papers and writing utensils. Mr. Shelby was busy in counting some bundles of bills, which, as they were counted, he pushed over to the trader, who counted them likewise.
"All fair," said the trader. "And now for signing these ere."
Mr. Shelby hastily drew the bills of sale toward him, and signed them, like a man that hurries over some disagreeable business, and then pushed them over with the money. Haley produced from a well-worn valise a parchment, which, after looking over it a moment, he handed to Mr. Shelby, who took it with a gesture of suppressed eagerness.
"Well, now, the thing's done," said the trader, getting up.
"It's done," said Mr. Shelby, in a musing tone, and fetching a long breath, repeated, "It's done."
"You don't seem to feel much pleased with it, 'pears to me," said the trader.
"Haley," said Mr. Shelby, "I hope you'll remember that you promised on your honor you wouldn't sell Tom without knowing what sort of hands he's going into."
"Why, you's just done it, sir," said the trader.
"Circumstances, you well know, obliged me," said Shelby, haughtily.
"Well, you know, they may oblige me, too," said the trader. "Howsomever, I'll do the very best I can in getting Tom a good berth. As to my treating on him bad, you needn't be a grain feared. If there's anything that I thank the Lord for, it is that I'm never no ways cruel."
After the expositions which the trader had previously given of his humane principles, Mr. Shelby did not feel particularly reassured by these declarations. But as they were the best comfort the case admitted of, he allowed the trader to depart in silence, and betook himself to a solitary cigar. End of chapter 4. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 5, showing the feelings of living property on changing owners. Mr. and Mrs. Shelby had retired to their apartment for the night. He was lounging in a large easy-chair looking over some letters that had come in the afternoon mail, and she was standing before her mirror brushing out the complicated braids and curls in which Eliza had arranged her hair. For noticing her pale cheeks and haggard eyes, she had excused her attendance that night and ordered her to bed. The employment, naturally enough, suggested her conversation with the girl in the morning, and turning to her husband she said carelessly,
"By the by, Arthur, who was that low-bred fellow that you lugged in to our dinner-table today?"
"Haley is his name," said Shelby, turning himself rather uneasily in his chair and continuing with his eyes fixed on a letter.
"Haley? Who is he, and what may be his business here, pray?"
"Well, he's a man that I transacted some business with last time I was at Natchez," said Mr. Shelby.
"And he presumed on it to make himself quite at home, and call and dine here, eh?"
"Why, I invited him. I had some accounts with him," said Shelby.
"Is he a negro trader?"
said Mrs. Shelby, noticing a certain embarrassment in her husband's manner. "Why, my dear, what put that into your head?" said Shelby, looking up.
"Nothing, only Eliza came in here after dinner in a great worry, crying and taking on, and said you were talking with a trader, and that she heard him make an offer for her boy, the ridiculous little goose."
"She did, eh?" said Mr. Shelby, returning to his paper, which he seemed for a few moments quite intent upon, not perceiving that he was holding it bottom upwards. "It will have to come out," said he mentally, "as well now as ever."
"I told Eliza," said Mrs. Shelby, as she continued brushing her hair, "that she was a little fool for her pains, and that you never had anything to do with that sort of persons. Of course I knew you never meant to sell any of our people, least of all to such a fellow."
"Well, Emily," said her husband, "so I have always felt and said, but the fact is that my business lies so that I cannot get on without. I shall have to sell some of my hands."
"To that creature? Impossible! Mr. Shelby, you cannot be serious."
"I'm sorry to say that I am," said Mr. Shelby. "I've agreed to sell Tom."
"What! Our Tom? That good, faithful creature? Been your faithful servant from a boy. Oh, Mr. Shelby, and you have promised him his freedom, too. You and I have spoken to him 100 times of it. Well, I can believe anything now. I can believe now that you could sell little Harry, poor Eliza's only child,"
said Mrs. Shelby, in a tone between grief and indignation. "Well, since you must know all, it is so. I have agreed to sell Tom and Harry both, and I don't know why I am to be rated as if I were a monster for doing what every one does every day."
"But why, of all others, choose these?" said Mrs. Shelby. "Why sell them, of all on the place, if you must sell it all?"
"Because they will bring the highest sum of any. That's why. I could choose another, if you say so. The fellow made me a high bid on Eliza, if that would suit you any better," said Mr. Shelby.
"The wretch!"
said Mrs. Shelby, vehemently. "Well, I didn't listen to it a moment. Out of regard to your feelings, I wouldn't. So give me some credit."
"My dear,"
said Mrs. Shelby, recollecting herself,
"forgive me. I have been hasty. I was surprised and entirely unprepared for this. But surely you will allow me to intercede for these poor creatures. Tom is a noble-hearted, faithful fellow, if he is black. I do believe, Mr. Shelby, that if he were put to it, he would lay down his life for you."
"I know it, I dare say. But what's the use of all this? I can't help myself."
"Why not make a pecuniary sacrifice? I'm willing to bear my part of the inconvenience. Oh, Mr. Shelby, I have tried most faithfully, as a Christian woman should, to do my duty to these poor, simple, dependent creatures. I have cared for them, instructed them, watched over them, and know all their little cares and joys for years. And how can I ever hold up my head again among them, if, for the sake of a little paltry gain, we sell such a faithful, excellent, confiding creature as poor Tom, and tear from him in a moment all we have taught him to love and value? I have taught them the duties of the family, of parent and child, and husband and wife, and how can I bear to have this open acknowledgment that we care for no tie, no duty, no relation, however sacred, compared with money? I have talked with Eliza about her boy, her duty to him as a Christian mother, to watch over him, pray for him, and bring him up in a Christian way. And now what can I say if you tear him away and sell him, soul and body, to a profane, unprincipled man, just to save a little money? I have told her that one soul is worth more than all the money in the world. And how will she believe me when she sees us turn round and sell her child? Sell him, perhaps, to certain ruin of body and soul." "I'm sorry you feel so about it, indeed I am," said Mr. Shelby. "And I respect your feelings, too, though I don't pretend to share them to their full extent. But I tell you now, solemnly, it's of no use. I can't help myself. I didn't mean to tell you this, Emily, but in plain words there is no choice between selling these two and selling everything. Either they must go, or all must. Haley has come into possession of a mortgage, which, if I don't clear off with him directly, will take everything before it. I've raked and scraped and borrowed, and all but begged, and the price of these two was needed to make up the balance, and I had to give them up. Haley fancied the child. He agreed to settle the matter that way, and no other. I was in his power, and had to do it. If you feel so to have them sold, would it be any better to have all sold?" Mrs. Shelby stood like one stricken. Finally, turning to her toilette, she rested her face in her hands, and gave a sort of groan. "This is God's curse on slavery, a bitter, bitter, most accursed thing. A curse to the master, and a curse to the slave. I was a fool to think I could make anything good out of such a deadly evil. It is a sin to hold a slave under laws like ours. I always felt it was. I always thought so when I was a girl. I thought so still more after I joined the church. But I thought I could gild it over. I thought by kindness and care and instruction I could make the condition of mine better than freedom. Fool that I was."
"Why, wife, you are getting to be an abolitionist, quite."
"Abolitionist! If they knew all I know about slavery, they might talk. We don't need them to tell us. You know I never thought that slavery was right, never felt willing to own slaves."
"Well, therein you differ from many wise and pious men," said Mr. Shelby. "You remember Mr. B.'s sermon the other Sunday?"
"I don't want to hear such sermons. I never wish to hear Mr. B. in our church again. Ministers can't help the evil, perhaps, can't cure it, any more than we can. But defend it! It always went against my common sense. And I think you didn't think much of that sermon, either."
"Well," said Shelby, "I must say these ministers sometimes carry matters further than we poor sinners would exactly dare to do. We men of the world must wink pretty hard at various things, and get used to a deal that isn't the exact thing. But we don't quite fancy when women and ministers come out broad and square, and go beyond us in matters of either modesty or morals, that's a fact. But now, my dear, I trust you see the necessity of the thing, and you see that I have done the very best that circumstances would allow."
"Oh, yes, yes," said Mrs. Shelby, hurriedly and abstractedly fingering her gold watch. "I haven't any jewelry of any amount," she added, thoughtfully. "But would not this watch do something? It was an expensive one, when it was bought. If I could only at least save Eliza's child, I would sacrifice anything I have."
"I'm sorry, very sorry, Emily," said Mr. Shelby.
"I'm sorry this takes hold of you so, but it will do no good.
The fact is, Emily, the thing's done. The bills of sale are already signed, and in Haley's hands, and you must be thankful it is no worse. That man has had it in his power to ruin us all, and now he is fairly off. If you knew the man as I do, you'd think that we had had a narrow escape."
"Is he so hard, then?"
"Why, not a cruel man exactly, but a man of leather, a man alive to nothing but trade and profit, cool and unhesitating and unrelenting as death and the grave. He'd sell his own mother at a good percentage, not wishing the old woman any harm, either."
"And this wretch owns that good, faithful Tom and Eliza's child?"
"Well, my dear, the fact is that this goes rather hard with me. It's a thing I hate to think of. Haley wants to drive matters, and take possession tomorrow. I'm going to get out my horse bright and early and be off. I can't see Tom, that's a fact. and you had better arrange a drive somewhere, and carry Eliza off. Let the thing be done when she is out of sight."
"No, no," said Mrs. Shelby. "I'll be in no sense accomplice or help in this cruel business. I'll go and see poor old Tom, God help him, in his distress. They shall see, at any rate, that their mistress can feel for and with them. As to Eliza, I dare not think about it. The Lord forgive us! What have we done that this cruel necessity should come on us?"
There was one listener to this conversation whom Mr. and Mrs. Shelby little suspected. Communicating with their apartment was a large closet, opening by a door into an outer passage. When Mrs. Shelby had dismissed Eliza for the night, her feverish and excited mind had suggested the idea of his closet, and she had hidden herself there, and with her ear pressed close against the crack of the door, had lost not a word of the conversation. When the voices died into silence, she rose and crept stealthily away. Pale, shivering, with rigid features and compressed lips, she looked an entirely altered being from the soft and timid creature she had been hitherto. She moved cautiously along the entry, paused one moment at her mistress's door, and raised her hands in mute appeal to heaven, and then turned and glided into her own room. It was a quiet, neat apartment on the same floor with her mistress. There was a pleasant sunny window where she had often sat singing at her sewing. There a little case of books, and various little fancy articles, ranged by them, the gifts of Christmas holidays. There was her simple wardrobe in the closet and in the drawers. Here was, in short, her home, and on the whole a happy one it had been to her. But there, on the bed, lay her slumbering boy, his long curls falling negligently around his unconscious face, his rosy mouth half open, his little fat hands thrown out over the bedclothes, and a smile spread like a sunbeam over his whole face.
"Poor boy, poor fellow," said Eliza. "They have sold you, but your mother will save you yet."
No tear dropped over that pillow. In such straits as these, the heart has no tears to give. It drops only blood, bleeding itself away in silence. She took a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote hastily:
"Oh, Mrs., dear Mrs., don't think me ungrateful. Don't think hard of me, anyway. I heard all you and Master said tonight. I'm going to try to save my boy. You will not blame me. God bless and reward you for all your kindness."
Hastily folding and directing this, she went to a drawer and made up a little package of clothing for her boy, which she tied with a handkerchief firmly around her waist. And so fond is a mother's remembrance that even in the terrors of that hour she did not forget to put in the little package one or two of his favorite toys, reserving a gaily painted parrot to amuse him when she should be called on to awaken him. It was some trouble to arouse the little sleeper, but after some effort he sat up, and was playing with his bird, while his mother was putting on her bonnet and shawl.
"Where are you going, mother?"
said he, as she drew near the bed with his little coat and cap. His mother drew near, and looked so earnestly into his eyes that he at once divined that something unusual was the matter.
"Hush, Harry," she said. "Mustn't speak loud, or they will hear us. A wicked man was coming to take little Harry away from his mother and carry him way off in the dark, but mother won't let him. She's going to put on her little boy's cap and coat and run off with him so the ugly man can't catch him."
Saying these words, she had tied and buttoned on the child's simple outfit, and, taking him in her arms, she whispered to him to be very still, and, opening a door in her room which led into the outer veranda, she glided noiselessly out. It was a sparkling, frosty, starlight night, and the mother wrapped the shawl close around her child, as, perfectly quiet with vague terror, he clung round her neck. Old Bruno, a great Newfoundland, who slept at the end of the porch, rose with a low growl as she came near. She gently spoke his name, and the animal, an old pet and playmate of hers, instantly wagging his tail, prepared to follow her, though apparently revolving much, in this simple dog's head, what such an indiscreet midnight promenade might mean. Some dim ideas of imprudence or impropriety in the measure seemed to embarrass him considerably, for he often stopped as Eliza glided forward, and looked wistfully, first at her and then at the house, and then, as if reassured by reflection, he pattered along after her again. A few minutes brought them to the window of Uncle Tom's cottage, and Eliza, stopping, tapped lightly on the window-pane. The prayer meeting at Uncle Tom's had, in the order of hymn-singing, been protracted to a very late hour, and, as Uncle Tom had indulged himself in a few lengthy solos afterwards, the consequence was that, although it was now between 12 and 1 o'clock, he and his worthy helpmeet were not yet asleep.
"Good Lord, what's that?"
said Aunt Chloe, starting up and hastily drawing the curtain.
"My sakes alive, if it ain't Lizzie! Get on your clothes, old man, quick! There's old Bruno, too, a-pawing around. What on earth? I'm going to open the door."
And suiting the action to the word, the door flew open, and the light of the tallow candle, which Tom had hastily lighted, fell on the haggard face and dark, wild eyes of the fugitive.
"Lord bless you, I'm skeered to look at you, Lizzie. Are you tuck sick, or what's come over you?"
"I'm running away, Uncle Tom and Aunt Chloe, carrying off my child. Master sold him."
"Sold him?"
echoed both, lifting up their hands in dismay.
"Yes, sold him," said Eliza firmly. "I crept into the closet by mistress's door tonight, and I heard Master tell Missus that he had sold my Harry, and you, Uncle Tom, both, to a trader, and that he was going off this morning on his horse, and that the man was to take possession today."
Tom had stood, during this speech, with his hands raised, and his eyes dilated like a man in a dream. Slowly and gradually, as its meaning came over him, he collapsed rather than seated himself on his old chair, and sunk his head down upon his knees.
"The good Lord have pity on us," said Aunt Chloe. "Oh, it don't seem as if it was true. But what has he done that Master should sell him?"
"He hasn't done anything. It isn't for that. Master don't want to sell, and Missus, she's always good. I heard her plead and beg for us, but he told her 'twas no use, that he was in this man's debt, and that this man had got the power over him, and that if he didn't pay him off clear, it would end in his having to sell the place and all the people and move off. Yes, I heard him say there was no choice between selling these two and selling all, the man was driving him so hard. Master said he was sorry, but, oh, Mrs., you ought to have heard her talk. If she ain't a Christian and an angel, there never was one. I'm a wicked girl to leave her so, but then I can't help it. She said herself one soul was worth more than the world, and this boy has a soul, and if I let him be carried off, who knows what'll become of it? It must be right, but if it ain't right, the Lord forgive me, for I can't help doing it."
"Well, old man," said Aunt Chloe, "why don't you go too? Will you wait to be toted down the river where they kill niggers with hard work and starving? I'd a heap rather die than go there any day. There's time for you. Be off with Lizzie. You've got a pass to come and go any time. Come, bustle up, and I'll get your things together."
Tom slowly raised his head and looked sorrowfully but quietly around and said, No, I ain't going. Let Eliza go, it's her right. I wouldn't be the one to say no. 'Tain't in nater for her to stay. But you heard what she said. If I must be sold, or all the people on the place and everything go to wreck, why, let me be sold. I suppose I can bar it as well as any of them," he added, while something like a sob and a sigh shook his broad, rough chest convulsively. "Master always found me on the spot. He always will. I never have broke trust, nor used my pass no ways contrary to my word, and I never will. It's better for me alone to go, than to break up the place and sell all. Master ain't to blame, Chloe, and he'll take care of you and the poor—" Here he turned to the rough trundle bed full of little woolly heads, and broke fairly down. He leaned over the back of the chair, and covered his face with his large hands. Sobs, heavy, hoarse, and loud, shook the chair, and great tears fell through his fingers on the floor. Just such tears, sir, as you dropped into the coffin where lay your firstborn son. Such tears, woman, as you shed when you heard the cries of your dying babe. For, sir, he was a man, and you are but another man. And woman, though dressed in silk and jewels, you are but a woman, and in life's great straits and mighty griefs ye feel but one sorrow."
"And now," said Eliza, as she stood in the door, "I saw my husband only this afternoon, and I little knew then what was to come. They have pushed him to the very last standing place, and he told me to-day that he was going to run away. Do try, if you can, to get word to him. Tell him how I went, and why I went, and tell him I'm going to try and find Canada. You must give my love to him, and tell him if I never see him again—" She turned away and stood with her back to them for a moment, and then added in a husky voice, "Tell him to be as good as he can, and try and meet me in the kingdom of heaven. Call Bruno in there," she added. "Shut the door on him, poor beast. He mustn't go with me." A few last words and tears, a few simple adieus and blessings, and clasping her wondering and affrighted child in her arms, she glided noiselessly away. End of chapter 5.